But first tonight, let's kick the show off with a brief comment about the retirement of Anastasia Palaszczuk. Now, you've probably heard it already, but the usual spin is going to be applied according to your political leanings. Those who are bending a bit to the right will claim she's abandoning ship before it hits the rocks, or perhaps that she's running out before there's an internal coup that takes her out. And the Labor-leaning lemmings, well, they're likely to say she deserves to go out a three-time winner, including being the first female Premier to be re-elected. From my perspective, all credit to her. She won a remarkable victory over Campbell Newman in 2012, starting with just 7 seats. But it's also fair to say she hasn't been challenged by the opposition since then. And that doesn't actually mean she's done a good job. To be perfectly honest, I don't think she has. But her stay on top of the political pile says a lot about the hopelessness of the LNP in Queensland over the past decade or so. But on top of that, and as usual I should say, I have a slightly different take on why she's actually going. Labor premiers like Palaszczuk and Dan Andrews in Victoria and Western Australia's McGowan, they've all made a brand out of opposing Canberra. Effectively, these have been professional whingers. They've painted every problem that they've faced, or that created themselves, as being Canberra's fault. And it's also Canberra's responsibility to fix. They turned this into some sort of art form, and it was swallowed by the gullible state media in all of those states. Canberra never gave them enough money or enough power, and the national settings were set against their states, or their local federal politicians had somehow sold them out. They were all variations on a theme of "it's not my fault." And these premiers played that theme over and over and over again. And similarly, these professional complainers, they hired most of the state media mouthpieces in their respective states to push their version of events. It was a brazen attempt to silence your potential critics and enlist them into your fold, but it proved to be very, very effective. And the problem is that there's no coalition government to blame anymore. And federal Labor, they don't take too kindly to being attacked by one of their own. And that means the likes of Andrews and Palaszczuk had to become accountable for almost the very first time in their careers. And it's fair to say accountability doesn't sit too well with them, any more than they like running a budget surplus, for example. So after 18 months of biting her tongue and having no one else to blame, Palaszczuk has chosen to exit stage left, just like Dan Andrews did. And Palaszczuk herself said her exit epiphany came around the National Cabinet table when she saw so many new faces. I mean, that must have been when she knew the game was up. She realised she couldn't spin her way out of this responsibility for any longer. I mean, you can't blame the new guy. No matter what her political achievements and her personal achievements, her approach to government responsibility and accountability will not be missed. And I'll tell you what else won't be missed, and it shouldn't be missed by you. There are some telltale signs that the Albanese government is failing where it matters most. Firstly, there's the tension evident in the behaviour of some of the most senior people. Attorney General Mark Dreyfus was the latest to snap when he berated a Sky News reporter during a recent press conference. Have a look.
I will not be apologising for pursuing the rule of law, and I will not be apologising for acting. Do not interrupt. I will not be apologising for acting. I will not be apologising for acting in accordance with a High Court decision. Your question is an absurd one.
Dreyfus tried to take some perceived high moral ground over the government's failure to prepare for and appropriately respond to the High Court's verdict on stateless illegal arrivals in our country. And that failure led to 149 detainees being released into our community, where a number of them, and 5 I can count thus far, have actually been arrested on allegations of further crimes, including one chap charged with 2 counts of indecent assault against a woman. Now, the usual political do-gooders, who always claim to champion the rights of women, they're strangely silent as they hoist on their own petard of hypocrisy. Many of these hypocrites reside in the ranks of the government and the Greens, There's a sprinkling in the crossbench and the coalition. They're the champions of, open borders and letting refugees come here and giving them all a fair go. And they say they want to protect women, but they've remained silent on this occasion. It's appalling. But we shouldn't be surprised by that, you see. So many of our politicians do not have any firm policy anchor. So that means they ebb and flow with the convenient tide or the populist tide, or, whatever suits them. And in doing so, they demonstrate neither leadership nor strength, only the shallow vacuousness of their desire to keep their job. And unsurprisingly, the Albanese government fits right into that shallow and vacuous job keepers framework. There is not a policy promise or an ideological commitment that they will not scrap if it means they can survive politically. And in some cases, scrapping those policies is really good for the country. But I have to say, it certainly isn't leadership. Let me give you an example. The Albanese government had a commitment, a firm commitment. It was in our national interest to the largest migration program in Australia's history. And over the last 12 months or so, more than 500,000 people have migrated here. While we're in the midst of a housing availability crisis, we've got an inflation shock, and we can scarcely able supply the electricity to those that are already here. Now, that immigration decision was an appalling policy, but the government steadfastly defended it, uphill and down dale. That is, until now. Apparently, immigration is going to be scaled back to, quote, sustainable levels, together with a crackdown on abuses of our intake of overseas students. These are the same abuses that they denied ever existed, by the way. This is a tacit admission by the government that what they were doing before was neither credible, it wasn't sustainable, and it certainly wasn't in the national interest. Now, I realise some may see this as a responsive move by the government. After all, they can, and believe me, they will claim they're merely reacting to current circumstances and public sentiment. Well, that's true. But that doesn't excuse the fact it was always going to be an obvious problem. But they persisted with it anyway. They can't say they were unaware. I mean, I've discussed the problems with the immigration intake and the rort of student visas for years on this show and in the Parliament. We got a brief respite during COVID-19, but the Albanese government, they opened the floodgates again. And the result has been that our quality of life has gone backwards. And now they're pretending their latest action is a virtue instead of a knee-jerk reaction, trying to buy them some political capital back. Now, the full details of the immigration overhaul is scheduled to be released tomorrow, I think, as the government seeks to recover from a terrible year. Part of that annus horribilis was the emphatic failure of the voice. Now, that failure was an excellent result for the country, but it was a disaster for the Albanese government. It's as if all their ideas for the country were hidden under the bushel of constitutional change. And that meant, had it passed, the next 2 years would have been non-stop chatter about how bad European settlement was for the country and how good and virtuous Aboriginal culture is for this country. But of course, when it failed, the Albanese government were as lost for words and ideas, I should say, as Minister Linda Burney during question time. Now, failure to act in the national interest is becoming a hallmark of this government. The passage of the latest Industrial Relations Bill this past week has taken the nation back 40 years, and it has real potential to damage employment and productivity. And it's no coincidence that the passage of the bill was achieved with the same band of hard left misfits in the Australian Senate that have previously enabled the worst excesses of this government. But no matter how bad that is, nowhere is the lack of national interest as demonstrable as in energy policy. Under the stewardship of Minister Chris Bowen, Australia is set to become an energy backwater, while we'll pay mightily for the privilege. There's a $1 trillion renewables electricity plan that is actually going to deliver higher prices and more energy insecurity than ever before. And for the record, it will not make one bit of difference to the climate. And so if that's not bad enough, Bowen, the minister responsible, steadfastly refuses to countenance the potential of nuclear energy in this country. Apparently, nuclear is okay for the climate change zealots at the recent COP28 conference in Dubai, I mean, just last week, more than 20 countries pledged to triple atomic capacity in a push to cut fossil fuel usage. Now, according to our intrepid minister, they must be stupid, because he keeps telling us that nuclear is neither economic nor feasible, and that the waste is environmentally unsound. Incredibly, his government endorses the use of floating nuclear power plants in the form of submarines, and they're even committed to building a nuclear repository for the waste. But somehow, floating nuclear plants are good, while those on terra-firma, they're verboten. It's forbidden, of course, except when it's located in the suburbs of Sydney, as our existing atomic research facility at Lucas Heights is. And did you know you can even store nuclear waste there in outdoor sheds? But please, please, whatever you do not put it safely somewhere in the outback. No, 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 that's forbidden. The lack of political vision and leadership is not exclusive to the current government, but I've got to point out they are the ones elected to run the country. I've got to tell you right now, the coalition is running policy rings around them. Peter Dutton, he appears to have learned from the mistakes of his recent predecessors and is actually putting the interests of Australian citizens first. That this approach resonates with people, it shouldn't surprise any of us. But it's actually caught the Albanese team unaware. And that's why there is so much tension evident in the government ranks. They are demonstrating all the skills of an entitled mid-level manager who got a promotion that they don't know what to do with. Frankly, that's not good enough for government in this country, and it's not good enough for the rest of us either.